Thank you so much for joining us at today's HR Matters, which we are presenting in conjunction with Greater Manchester Chamber of Commerce. For anyone who hasn't attended one of our HR Matters sessions before, we typically run these bi-monthly. They're suitable for anyone who is a HR professional or who's responsible for people within their organisation. By way of introduction, my name's Laura Tracy. I'm a partner in the Manchester employment team here at Freeths, and I'm joined today by a very special guest. I've got Polly Noonan with me, who is Corporate Partnerships Manager at Tommy's, working with the Pregnancy and Parenting at Work programme, which supports businesses in supporting their employees with all their different pregnancy journeys. And Freeths are a really proud member of Pregnancy and Parenting at Work. So we're really pleased to be able to present this session together, and delighted that you've chosen to join us today. So what are we going to talk about today? If we just have a look at our next slide, please, Tom. Super. Well, one of the reasons for holding today's session is that we're coming up on Baby Loss Awareness Week. And so we'll be talking about why that's important and the relevance of it potentially to our employees. We're also going to touch on the kind of the legal framework around baby loss, the impact of baby loss, and then what does sort of good and bad look like in terms of supporting our employees. And Polly's also going to help sort of direct us to where there's resources available for those that are attending today's session, so that you can support your employees in the best possible way. So, Polly, thank you so much for joining us. As I mentioned, we're coming up on Baby Loss Awareness Week. So can you tell those people that are on the call today, what is it, why is it important, and I suppose what are Tommy's doing around Baby Loss Awareness Week as well?
Yeah. Oh, hi everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here. So for those that don't know, Baby Loss Awareness Week happens every year in October from the 9th to the 15th. And really it's a time for people to come together and remember all the much loved babies who died too soon. So it's really a time for commemoration and memory. And on the last day of Baby Loss Awareness Week every year, it culminates in something called the Wave of Light, which is a global event. And really it's a moment for people to light a candle and just kind of have that moment, which can be quite private or a kind of collective moment as well. On social media, you'll see a lot of people sort of sharing what they're doing to mark that moment. And it can be really powerful and a very moving sort of way to finish Baby Loss Awareness Week. And really it's a time for everyone to sort of connect, those with similar experiences, or often people can feel quite alone in their grief. And so Baby Loss Awareness Week sort of just brings people together and has that sense of connection. And really it's also a time to raise awareness of the impact of pregnancy and baby loss, something that we will talk about a bit more later on, but the sort of impact of it is often underestimated. And so for charities like Tommy's, it's a really important time in our kind of calendar to be able to really campaign for more support, for better care, and to just remind people really that charities like Tommy's are here to support people that need us, and to just really raise awareness of our work and the support that's available.
That's brilliant. So for the people that are on the call, they may have colleagues who are sort of recognising Baby Loss Awareness Week and doing their own sort of wave of light as well. So it's important, I suppose, that employers recognise that and are aware of how, particularly if they know someone has experienced a loss themselves.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it means so much for employees who are impacted to see that recognition from their workplace, because it is often something, it's often an experience that can be sort of kept quiet, and there isn't that visibility a lot of the time. And so to see that at work, where we spend so much of our time, it is really important. And I know some businesses that we work with will sort of, on the Monday following Baby Loss Awareness Week, will sort of do a bit of reflection on the wave of light, and if employees are comfortable, kind of share share what they were posting and sort of sharing online the evening before, just to sort of again raise awareness and give that visibility.
Yeah, that sounds great. And obviously, you work with a number of different organisations as well as Freeths. So if you've any tips for employers as we go through, or suggestions of ways in which employers can recognise Baby Loss Awareness Week, then obviously do share them. That's great. And it's important, I suppose, that employers also understand the kind of the legal framework around baby loss as well, and what protections or not protections, as we'll come on to see, exist. So I'll kind of highlight a little bit around that. I think we've got a slide next on the legal framework, Tom. Super. In terms of terminology, I suppose it's useful to understand, I suppose, the distinction from a legal perspective and of how baby loss is, I suppose, characterized. It feels very sort of brutal and hard to sort of be talking in these terms, doesn't it? But the distinction is important from a legal perspective, unfortunately. So the terms that the NHS use is that a stillbirth is when a baby is not born alive after at least 24 complete weeks of pregnancy. And if a baby dies before 24 weeks, so before 24 weeks, it's known as a miscarriage or a late fetal loss. And as I say, that distinction is important for legal purposes too. So when a child is stillborn after 24 weeks of pregnancy, or where a child is born alive at any stage of the pregnancy but then doesn't survive, which commonly be referred to as a kind of a neonatal death, all the legal consequences of childbirth apply. So the employee would be entitled to maternity leave, and this would start the day after the birth. The employee can return to work at any time before the end of the maternity leave period on giving 8 weeks notice, in the same way as if the baby had lived. But she may give less notice if the employer agrees. But in the same way as typical maternity leave, the mother can't return to work in the first 2 weeks after birth. So that compulsory maternity leave period still applies. Statutory maternity pay is also available in a case of a stillbirth, and paternity leave also applies in the same way. There's also, since April 2020, legislation which has been passed in relation to statutory parental bereavement leave, which is in addition to maternity and maternity leave. And I think we might have some details of that on the next slide. Super. So as I say, relatively new, I suppose, employment into the last years, this legislation was passed, and this entitled qualifying employees to 2 weeks leave following the death of a child under the age of 18, and also applies to a child who's stillborn after 24 weeks of pregnancy. Also applies in cases of abortion after 24 weeks, and there are sort of very limited circumstances in which an abortion can take place after 24 weeks. For example, if the mother's life is at risk, or the child will be born with a severe disability. So this is called statutory parental bereavement leave. Employees have this right from the day they start their job. So it's a day one right. There's no qualifying service for parental bereavement leave. But the employee must tell their employer, which is called giving notice, that they want parental bereavement leave. But that notice doesn't have to be in writing. So this right applies to the birth parent, to the what's called the natural parent, so the person who gave birth to the child who's since been adopted, adoptive parents if the child was living with them, or a person who lived with the child and had responsibility for them at least for the 4 weeks before they passed away. And also intended parents for surrogacy and the partners of the child's parent as well, if they live with the child and the child's parent in an enduring family relationship. Parental bereavement leave can be taken in the 56 weeks following their child's death. And the entitlement is to 1 whole week of leave, 2 consecutive weeks, or 2 separate weeks at different times. And as with a lot of the sort of family protections, family legal protections, employees are protected from dismissal or detriment, God forbid, for exercising their right to take parental bereavement leave. Now, there's also an entitlement to parental bereavement pay, but like the other sort of family rights, it's a qualifying service to it. So the employee has to have worked for at least 26 weeks in order to be eligible to receive parental bereavement pay. And there's that lower earnings limit that they also have to meet, which is the £123 per week before tax. And statutory parental bereavement leave is, I suppose, the minimum amount that employees must pay staff eligible to receive it. And eligible employees will either get £172.48 a week or 90% of their average weekly earnings, whichever is the lower of the two. But that's very much the sort of the basic minimum protection, and it's astonishing, I suppose, that it's so long to even have this, but it's not particularly generous, I suppose, given the circumstances. So some employers do offer enhanced bereavement pay that's more than statutory parental bereavement pay, and I suppose the amount and how long employees would receive it for should be set out in an organisation's bereavement policy or in contractual terms. And an ACAS guidance does recommend that employers do have a workplace bereavement policy to set out those entitlements. There are other types of leave which may be available in these circumstances. So employees may receive unpaid time off under the time off for dependents rights. But however, this right is really more for dealing with sort of the practical matters arising on the death of a child, such as sort of attending a funeral and registering the death. So doesn't really give employees an awful lot, and is more for a more sort of limited period. And as I say, is unpaid unless the employer decides to offer something further. And then your organisation may offer sort of compassionate leave as well, and that's at the organisation's discretion. So that's the case where we're talking about stillbirth. But when it comes to miscarriage, so if you remember, miscarriage being the loss of a child in the first 24 weeks of pregnancy, there is no entitlement to parental bereavement leave. There are no statutory rights to maternity leave or paternity leave or the related pay associated with those. If an employee was absent for medical grounds following a miscarriage, then that should be treated as pregnancy-related sickness, and therefore kind of not taken into account for things like absence triggers and sort of disciplinary action and those sorts of things. And we know that pregnancy and maternity is still a protected characteristic. And so if an employee's put at a disadvantage or treated less favourably because of a pregnancy-related illness or the related time off, then that could amount to discrimination. But in terms of actual, what happens if one of your employees is unfortunate enough to suffer a miscarriage, the basic legal position is that there is very little sort of support available, time off, pay, other than what, as an employer, you are able to, willing to offer. now Polly will probably touch on this as well, but we've had two private members' bills, haven't we, that were presented to Parliament in 2021, which were intended to kind of make provision for paid leave for people who have experienced miscarriage. But there's been no commitment at all from our government providing paid miscarriage leave, or even extending that parental bereavement leave and pay to cover miscarriages. Although a bit more advanced in Northern Ireland, I understand that paid miscarriage leave is going to be introduced in Northern Ireland by April 2026, but obviously not in England and Wales at the current time. So it feels like, Polly, we have this huge, big, gaping hole in protection when it comes to miscarriage, and how big an issue is that? How many people is that sort of likely to affect? What's the impact of that, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a massive issue, and especially kind of, I know those definitions are the legal definitions, but when you kind of think about somebody's experience from, say, 22, 23 weeks of pregnancy, it's going to be very, very similar to somebody who is in the legal definition of having experienced a stillbirth. And to think that those two people's experience and rights are so different when they're going through something so physically similar is just really devastating. And similarly, miscarriage is the most common type of loss, and 1 in 4 pregnancies in the UK do end in complications or loss. And so when you consider that's 1 in 4 of your employees, sort of no matter what size business you are, that is going to be impacting a significant percentage of your workforce. And the sort of important thing is that is happening whether you know about it or not, because I think without that sort of legislation support, a lot of employees won't talk about what's happened to them because they don't know what support is available to them. And then also sort of bringing in the stigma and the silence, it just means that people won't often sort of disclose what they're going through, and then they might end up using annual leave or sick leave or a different type of leave that isn't representative of the thing that they're going through. So it is a really big issue, because miscarriage and early pregnancy loss as well is very traumatic, very distressing. Often it's very physically distressing as well. I think for so long and this is changing, but there are still attitudes and misconceptions that losing a baby in early pregnancy is just something that happens, that it's no different to a period, and that is just simply not the case. And so I think so much sort of increased understanding is needed to really know that experience is both physically and emotionally distressing, and to think about as a business in this weird period where this bill is sort of moving but not moving very quickly, and businesses need to sort of be thinking, well, what can I do in this interim period to be flexible, to offer sort of increased support, whether that is going so far as sort of implementing a policy, or whether it's just sort of having really clear guidance around what is available if that happens. Because without something sort of in black and white, an employee just is going to be too afraid to talk about what's happened and to ask for support, because it just isn't clear.
Yeah, I can completely understand. And I suppose in cases of kind of early loss as well, sometimes employees have that fear of letting employers know that they're trying for a baby as well, because we see that with employees who are pregnant in the cases that we deal with. And so then you're going through that, but you're going through that in silence without the support of your employer, because you're feeling like, well, I don't want them to know, which is horrendous that any woman feels like that, but that I don't want them to know that I'm wanting to start a family. So that's probably compounds it as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, 100%. We speak to women and families all the time about their workplace experiences, and that is a really sort of big factor, is that fear and anxiety around revealing what their future plans might look like, and how attitudes might shift towards them in the workplace, which is just really sad, especially when going through something so emotionally and physically distressing anyway, to have that as another level and another layer. And really what we want is for employees to to feel as though that no matter sort of what they're going through, like a healthy pregnancy journey or a loss, that they're going to be met with kindness and support, really. And interestingly, when we first started developing pregnancy and parenting at work, we ran a couple of surveys in 2021 and 2022. And one of the really sort of key things that came out of that, I think it was 69% of the respondents said that they thought their manager would support them through something like a difficult pregnancy or through pregnancy and baby loss, but only 33% said that their manager would know how to. So it's showing that there's also like that gap in knowledge and understanding and confidence, and we know that that's not necessarily a manager's fault or HR's fault. It's just generally there is that lack of understanding of what those experiences look like. And so we know that like an education piece is needed as well for most businesses to support them to know how to navigate those conversations, because you kind of have to empower the employees who are going through it to feel supported to ask for support, but then they need to be met by somebody who also knows how to respond in return.
So would you say that kind of training is the most important thing to kind of getting this right? What does sort of good look like in terms of support for employees?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many things, and training is probably at the sort of the end game, I suppose, in a way, because I completely appreciate that businesses of different sizes and different resources can't necessarily go straight into like investing in a training program, and we completely understand that, and wanted to sort of reassure businesses on the call today that there are loads of things before that point that make a really significant difference. And the first one that I'll talk about is free and something that businesses of any size can do, and that really is just being kind and being supportive. And really what an employee is going to remember when they're going through such a difficult moment in their lives is how their employer made them feel, and that's something that everyone is capable of doing. And it really comes down to sort of listening to what your employee is going through, being able to sort of meet them with understanding, listening to them, and really trying to be flexible in the support that you can offer. So obviously all businesses will have, some may or may not have a policy for miscarriage leave, some may or may not have training, but it's really sort of listening in that moment to what your employee is asking for and doing whatever you can to meet their needs wherever possible. And that flexibility really is key. And I guess that takes time and sort of confidence as well to be able to navigate different policies and processes. But it really does come down to that kindness and that flexibility. And then, I mean, on the policy side of things, if you are a business that has got the resources to consider implementing a specific policy for paid miscarriage leave, then that is 100% something that we would recommend, because as I was saying earlier, without that allowance or that recognition in sort of black and white, we know from what women and families talk to us about that they just won't ask for the support if they go through their policies and don't see it listed as something available to them. So that could be sort of a full-blown policy, or it could be guidance, as I mentioned earlier, but somewhere where it says very explicitly and explicitly references miscarriage and a loss before 24 weeks is really quite important if that's something you do have sort of the capability to do. And sort of on the same note, it's really important to think about where that sits in your wider policies, and the journey that your employee would need to go on to access it. We've heard before, and I think this is quite common, and again, not necessarily like a flaw of the business, but sometimes this allowance or the policy will be sat sort of as part of the wider maternity policy and maternity leave policy. And obviously then it probably means that an employee who's experienced a loss is going through paragraphs of what happens when your baby arrives and all of the lovely side of pregnancy. And it's just having that sort of increased awareness of minimizing any additional pain for them, I suppose, when trying to access support from work. So I'd say there's some of the really kind of key things that make a difference. And really just breaking the silence. It always comes back to that as well, being prepared to be brave and to be a business that puts pregnancy and baby loss on the agenda in whatever way you can. So that could be signposting to Tommy's, for example, or other charities working in this space at times like Baby Loss Awareness Week, or other difficult times for bereaved parents, like Mother's Day and Father's Day can be quite difficult times. So can the Christmas period can be really difficult. So just sort of having that support and signposting available at those times throughout the year can make a really big difference. And just continuing conversations like this really, and providing space for experts to come in and talk, or for employees to come together themselves and share their experiences. It's just, as I've said previously, kind of making this topic visible and recognizing that it is something that is very devastating, and that you're an employee that will stand by you're an employer who will stand by your employees, sort of no matter what experience they're going through on their sort of parenthood journey.
Yeah, some really practical guidance there, and like you say, not things that you need awful lots of resources for, that any organization can think about implementing, and leading with kindness seems to be at the forefront of all of that, and I suppose recognizing that everybody's experience of baby loss is different, isn't it? So what one employee might need in terms of support from the business could be really different to another's, couldn't it?
Yes, 100%. And it's the same for employees who are on a uncomplicated pregnancy journey as well, and having that kind of, again, increased awareness that no two pregnancy journeys are the same, and somebody who is I guess supposedly having an uncomplicated pregnancy journey might have their own experience of loss from before, and so they might be feeling more anxious and might need to attend more appointments, and not exactly like you say, Laura, not thinking, well, the last time I supported someone who was pregnant, they didn't need that, so why did they need it this time? It's just really trying to challenge any of those thoughts that you have, and really center the person and listen to what they're telling you they need, and coming back to just meeting them with kindness.
No, that's a really good tip. And what do you, how, I suppose you will also speak to individuals, I guess, who are going through their own pregnancy journey, and what does sort of bad look like in terms of lack of support? How do you see that kind of manifest itself then with that employee? Where does it go to? We obviously see the sort of the legal risk side, but there's probably a lot more that happens before it gets to sort of claims and those sorts of things.
Yeah. Well, I think the biggest sort of example of what bad looks like is just not recognizing or acknowledging the loss or what the employee has been through. And we know that often stems from a fear of saying the wrong thing, but what all employees we speak to tell us is that saying nothing is absolutely worse, and that we hear stories of employees sort of returning to work following any type of loss, but sometimes, for example, after a stillbirth, if they're coming back after what would have been their maternity period, coming back into the workplace, and nobody acknowledging what's happened to them, and almost ignoring them completely, because they don't, a lot of people will say that they don't want to cause any additional pain, but the employee who's going through it, that there is no additional pain that can be caused, because they're going through the most heartbreaking experience of their lifetime. So somebody not acknowledging it is the worst thing that can happen, really. I think also assuming that when an employee comes back to work, that they're that they'll eventually kind of get over it, or that their grief will eventually pass. And that again is just not the case. Grief is, well, grief of all kinds, any sort of bereavement is something that stays with you forever. It's not something that you sort of move on from. It's something that you sort of learn to grow around, and it stays with you. And so I think colleagues and employees and managers can sometimes fall down by thinking that after a certain period of time, it's not something that matters to that employee anymore. And things like anniversaries and due dates and birthdays, they can be really triggering times. And an employee will still need support at those times, even if it's 2 to 3 years later. It can still be very triggering. And one of the kind of key stats, again, from the surveys I mentioned from a couple of years ago, was that 60% of professional women will leave their organisation within a year of returning from maternity leave, which is a really staggering statistic. And the reasons for that all sort of came back to this lack of sympathy and a lack of understanding. And so that sort of communication piece is really where we see these sort of bad examples happening, I suppose, because even where policies and processes are really strong and that flexibility is there and that paid time off might be there, if the communication and those interactions between whether it's between HR and the employee, or the line manager and the employee, or really sort of any colleague, any team member that interacts with that employee, if that understanding and that ability to have that really sensitive conversation isn't there, then more often than not, that employee will come away feeling really deflated, really let down by their employer. And it's quite hard to come back from. They often will then think about, well, if my employer can't support me through this really devastating, awful time in my life, what else aren't they going to be there for me through? So I think it's I know, Laura, you'll go on to sort of talk about what the sort of longer term impacts are, but that sort of initial communication piece really does set the scene for whether that employee has a sense of real loyalty and trust for their organization, or whether they feel like they've been really let down, really disappointed, and then it's quite hard to come back from that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I suppose as employment lawyers, we see it where things have really deteriorated in terms of the relationship. So I suppose first and foremost, employees are probably more likely to to go off sick. There are obviously associated sort of anxiety, depression, the manner in which they've been treated by the business, increased absence, and then ultimately employees, like you say, may choose to leave the organization. There is obviously a really important moral case for supporting employees in these circumstances, but if you're that way inclined, there's also a very important business case for supporting employees with this as well, and that's the impact on retention, on engagement, as well as managing the legal risk of getting this wrong. As I mentioned, employees obviously have protection from discrimination in the case of pregnancy and maternity. Sex discrimination would also come in here. So if you've treated an employee less favourably, failing to provide that support, or as you say, sort of isolated or treated someone less favourably because they have gone through this experience, and maybe they're not turning up to work with 100% that day because they have been through something so devastating. You can't expect employees to be bouncing back when something so seismic has happened in their lives, and failing to recognize that, like I say, has a legal impact as well as a really significant moral impact that you should want to avoid as an organization. And then I suppose that's the sort of the bad side. What can we do? How the people that have come on this call today are obviously, they're already converted, aren't they? Because they've got an interest in this, and they've, you know, they want to do something better for their organizations, which is amazing. So what sorts of resources are available for different sized employers? Because we'll have a range of different sort of employer sizes on the call today. I think that would be helpful to know.
Yeah, of course. And I think the first step is looking online, really. There's tons of free resources and information on websites like ours at Tommy's, which are a really, really good starting point, and obviously free to access, so available for anyone of any businesses of any size. On the sort of training side of things, which we touched on earlier, at Tommy's, we have our Pregnancy and Parenting at Work program. So that's an e-training program that has been created to really sort of help with the communication side of things. And I'll go on to say a little bit more about how different sized businesses can access that in a moment. But this is just on the screen of a brief overview of the e-training content. And as you can see, it sort of covers the entirety of the pregnancy spectrum, really. So there are 3 courses in total. First one sort of manages the uncomplicated pregnancy side of things. So thinking about kind of supporting your employee as they work their way towards maternity leave, and then that period where they're away from the business, and then the managing and supporting the return to work. And then the second course is very much focused on how to support someone through pregnancy and baby loss, or through premature birth as well, which is another quite complicated situation for parents that is, again, quite misunderstood. So that second course is really sort of plugging a gap that we identified in terms of everything we've discussed today, really, in terms of the lack of understanding and awareness, and it's been designed to increase managers' confidence, really, in having those conversations so that they are prepared. As we were saying earlier, 1 in 4 will be impacted, and so it does feel like a case of when it happens rather than if it happens. And we have had businesses come to us at Tommy's and say that a colleague has experienced a loss, and what can they do? How do they have this conversation? They want to really support them, but they don't know how. And we're very grateful that they come to us and they seek that expert advice. But we would really love that is done proactively, so that at the moment that conversation happens, they already have all of that knowledge and information. And that's exactly what these courses have been designed to do. And then the third one is a new course, actually, which is launching in the next few months, all around fertility in the workplace. So again, very complex situation for employees, again, quite misunderstood. And that course sort of really increases awareness around different fertility journeys, the physical sort of an emotional impact of that, and what employees can do to support someone through it. So that's the e-training in a snapshot. And then on the next slide, there's just a bit more information about the additional resources that come alongside the training courses. So these have been designed to sort of be helpful for all size businesses. So there's some template policies in there. So for those that are more sort of limited on resources and time, we've just tried to make that as easy as possible, so it can be something that is lifted and just sort of tweaked for your own business. There's also a series of written guides. So again, really sort of concise, informative resources on things like shared parental leave, maternity, paternity pay, just really trying to consolidate everything into these resources, so that managers, HR don't feel like they need to sort of scramble away online trying to get the information that they need to have these conversations, but just sort of really clear guidance ready for them to access. There's some risk assessment templates, there's a calculator that sort of tells you which dates you need to be aware of along the employee's maternity journey. There's phone line access to the Tommy's midwives. So there's a whole host of things that are available as part of the membership. And then the final point there is the option to become an accredited Tommy's champion, which one of the sort of criteria is that you are a member of the program, but then the other sort of elements relate to your policies, whether you offer sort of enhanced maternity and paternity pay and leave and things like that. But really that's a sort of a guiding star, I suppose, as to what Tommy's would see as an employer who is really sort of an example of best practice. And so it's not something that we expect businesses to be able to say that they can do straight away, but it is quite a helpful guide and checklist of something to work towards. And then at the end, you get that sort of recognition and are able to really celebrate that you're doing everything and beyond for your pregnant employees. And importantly, which we haven't actually touched upon, for the dads and partners as well. Because
Dads, I was going to come to that.
yeah, very much all of everything we've talked about, it all applies to them as well. And they're often, as I have done today, left out of the conversation. And it's really important that if there's a partner of someone who's experienced a loss and you're managing and supporting the partner, that all of that kindness and flexibility and understanding is all extended to them as well, because that grief is just as real for them. So just really important to say that as well.
Yeah, good. Well, you've stolen one of my questions, Polly, which was going to be around how do we support our partners? But no, that's great, and thank you. It's great. It's absolutely amazing to hear everything that Tommy's doing. You're flooded with resources. There, many of which are coming of no cost whatsoever. So, there's really no excuses, is there, for not kind of getting in touch and moving these things along. And as we know, it's such a common issue. It seems bizarre that it's not a real focus for employers, and there is such an emphasis on employers being around inclusion and diversity and all of those things, but this seems to be sort of missing from that message in a way, doesn't it? This is something for an employer to be able to do to help their employees, but also to demonstrate to the wider world, we're an employer of choice. We're an employer that cares about our employees' lives outside of work, and that's a really strong message, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And it's a really strong message for people that might be joining the business in the future, but also for people that are already in the business and might not be at the point where they're thinking about starting a family, but to see that their business recognizes it as a really significant life milestone really creates a very reassuring environment for current employees as well. So it definitely should be on EDI agendas, and I know that there definitely is a shift, and we're seeing that happening with the businesses that come to us and want to sort of make these changes happen. But in a sort of world where there are loads of competing priorities and there's a lot on businesses' plates in terms of what they want to do next, it's just making sure that this stays sort of top of the agenda, because it does have a really sort of long-term impact when that support it is right, and also when it's not so right as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've got 1 minute left. So just having a look at the questions that have come through. So somebody's asked what are some of the things businesses can do to recognise Baby Loss Awareness Week? I mean, it might be listening to this webinar. This is recorded. You'll be sent a recording after the session. It might be that you want your managers to understand the impact of this and some of the things that they can be doing and where they can find resources as well. But is there anything else, Polly, that you think would be good to point to?
Yeah, I think just signposting, like you say, like this webinar. The Tommy's website will have a hub for Baby Loss Awareness Week, which will have lots of supportive information and resources, and also loads of case study stories of families that have been through similar experiences. And I think that, again, that visibility, that sort of mirroring is really helpful for employees who might be feeling alone and sort of isolated, to see others that have been through something similar and to see the journey that they went on. So I think signposting to Tommy's is a really and also there's lots of other charities too. There's SANS and the Miscarriage Association. So there are lots of places that you can signpost your employees to. I also think in sort of newsletters or internal comms, intranets, just sort of highlighting that Baby Loss Awareness Week is happening, giving the dates, letting your employees know that the Wave of Light is something that they can get involved in, sort of privately on the Sunday night at 7 o'clock. And if there are employees that want to share their stories, that can also be a really powerful thing to facilitate as well. We know that when somebody sort of is brave enough to speak up in their organization, it really helps others to feel like they're in a safe space and that they will be looked after if they're going through something similar. They might not want to talk about it at that time, but to see that that conversation is happening and that others around them are talking about it is really reassuring. And that's obviously quite a hard thing to ask of somebody. But from our experience, there are often people that want to share their experience, which is really kind, very brave, but it really can be quite powerful. So I think thinking about ways that you might be able to facilitate that during Baby Loss Awareness Week could be really important.
Fantastic. And in terms of the timing, just remind us again what the dates are for Baby Loss Awareness Week.
So it's the 9th to the 15th of October, and the Wave of Light happens on the 15th, which will be a Sunday this year.
Okay, thank you so much. We've run out of time today, but I hope that you've all found that session helpful. It's been really insightful for me as well. So thank you so much, Polly, for joining us. I really appreciate it, and pass on all our best to everybody at Tommy's who we know are doing great work. You will be sent a copy of the slides and the recording of this session following today's session. But if you do have any questions, then do contact me, and there'll also be the ways in which you can contact Tommy's as well for further support should you wish to. But for now, thank you very much. Good morning, and thanks very much for joining us.